You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. And I'm joined today, ladies and gentlemen, by an individual who is extremely well regarded by a wide range of folks across our country and certainly in intellectual and scientific spaces and beyond. Professor Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker is the Johnstone Family Professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. He is the author of a good number of books, including Enlightenment Now, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and more recently, he's got a book coming out entitled Rationality, and we will hear more about that shortly. Professor Pinker, it's a pleasure to have you here, my friend.
Thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Well, you know what? I was very excited to have this conversation, I have to say. And let's take advantage of the time to sort of plumb the depths a little bit in terms of analyzing just sort of what the state of our discourse is in American society, how the sort of deep-seated polarizations in American society are showing up in the academy and in other institutions, and hopefully provide the audience with some constructive instincts in terms of how we might understand the sort of the value, perhaps the intrinsic value, of having a conversational culture that actually functions when it comes to comparing and contrasting differing political and social points of view for those of us who are interested in seeing society progress. But where I want to start is by getting from you just a little bit of an articulation of the themes that you tend to focus on in your work, insofar as your focus has been on the state of society and really being appreciative of the tremendous material and social progress that we have made, not just in the United States, but across so much of global society over the recent century and perhaps even within shorter periods of time. And I know that this focus has very much to do with what you write about in The Better Angels of Our Nature, and I think Enlightenment Now as well. So, what is it that what is your assessment, broadly speaking? Let's leave 2020 out of it for just a second. But broadly speaking, what do we have to be thankful for in terms of the state of human society over the course of relatively recent times?
Yes, the state of the world, despite the things that go wrong, the pandemic being the foremost in our minds, the when you actually plot measures of human well-being over time, that is where you don't look at the news, which is a highly non-random sample of the worst things happening anywhere on Earth on a given day. That's what news is. Instead, you look at measures like how many people can read, how many people are killed in wars, how many people are below the line that we might call extreme poverty, how many women are sexually assaulted, how many kids are beaten. Over time, you find that in almost every one of those measures, you see improvement. It is not a straight line. Nothing in history is a straight line. There are reversals. Sometimes they're sickening ones, but overall, the trend is toward improvement. Now, you could never see that if you were to get your impression of the world from the news, because a combination of just the way news works and the way our minds work. And I should say, as background, I am a cognitive psychologist. What I do for a living is try to figure out how the mind works and teach students about it. And one of the ways the mind works is we use available images and narratives and anecdotes from memory as our way of gauging what the world is like. We think of a terrorist attack, and it's easy to remember them. We conclude, oh, we're not safe on the streets. A bomb might go off at any moment. We read about a shark attack. We say, oh, I'm not going in the water. What we don't do is compensate for the fact that shark attacks make really good news stories. I mean, you're going to get your eyeballs, you're going to get your clicks, but very few people are eaten by sharks. Lots and lots of people die in car crashes. But a car crash is just not news. It's boring. And so the fact that you are way more likely to die in a car crash than get eaten by a shark just doesn't really sink in. Now think about the news. The news is about gory images and anecdotes, things that go well, like a city that has not been attacked by terrorists or a rampage shooter, a country that is not at war, a country that's not having a famine. Well, nothing's happening. It's not news, so you don't read about them. Also, things that kind of creep up a few percentage points at a time, like poverty going down bit by bit, year after year after year across the world, or lifespan going up, people living longer and longer, or fewer kids dying of disease by a few percentage points every year, but maybe compounding. We all know what compound interest can do.
Right.
Then the world can be transformed and no one knows about it. Now, this can be a problem for not just because of sheer ignorance, but you could think all of our institutions are failing. Things are getting worse and worse. Just look at the papers, look at the headlines. Whereas if in reality, things are creeping up and getting better, then we should think, well, obviously there are problems. New problems pop up, like pandemics. But let's try to build on what is working gradually, as opposed to smashing the machine or electing a savior who promises only I can fix it. That's why I have argued that an awareness of the world through data, through statistics, through trends is absolutely crucial. And it also gives us, and this relates, of course, to the theme of braver angels, it gives us a kind of a common frame of reference. And if you have one side saying, well, we're not safe from terrorists, and the other saying, well, terrorism is no big deal. Well, let's go to the data and see who's right, or street crime, or any other social problem. Now, this doesn't guarantee that people will agree, because you can always spin doctor the data. But at least if you have a joint commitment that none of us knows everything, we're all fallible, we're all ignorant, but let's try to look at whatever facts might help settle our disputes. It's better than just two sides, screaming insults at each other.
Indeed. Well, we can agree on that. I heard popular author and psychologist Jordan Peterson, who I know you've spoken to on a couple of occasions, make an interesting and I think a useful sort of distinction between the problems of absolute deprivation and the problems of relative deprivation. And I think that the point that he was making in that was that on the one hand, we have sort of a state of affairs in society where if you zoom out, you'll see the trends and the patterns that you're articulating, Stephen. And there's a story to be told about the sort of dramatic progress that humanity has made across a whole host of material and social categories. That these are things to be grateful for. On the other hand, I think that people have a tendency to sort of, in a sense, maybe judge the state of the world by the degree to which they are or are not near to the quality of life that they want to experience for themselves, or maybe that they want to see for their group. And particularly when there is maybe an inequality in society that seems to be unjust. Let's say the fact that I have, a higher level of income than I might have had, a century past in civilization, may seem to be relatively cold comfort relative to the fact that I feel exploited by this other class of folks that I perceive as doing maybe not just better than me, but better for reasons that are dishonest or exploitative. And so there's a psychological challenge here, I suspect, because I think that we are not well positioned to appreciate the larger truth that you are expounding upon, in part, for these sorts of reasons. And yet, particularly when it comes to folks who are in a position to sort of analyze the state of society in the public sphere, who are commenting on our realities, um, it seems like having this larger picture is a part of what should give us perspective in the national conversations we have, in the political conversations that we have as a country. So, do you experience that kind of? Do you come up against that sort of frustration when you communicate these ideas?
Absolutely. No, you've raised a number of profound questions in economics, in psychology, psychology of well-being. You can imagine an extreme view in which people only compare themselves to their neighbors. And so no matter how well off they are, if the Joneses have, a bigger car, a bigger house, a swimming pool, you feel poor. Even if by world standards, historical standards, you're in the top 1%, you look to the person who's even richer than you are. Now that turns out to there is an element of truth to that, but imagine that you open your paycheck and you have a 5% raise. Well, you're in a really great mood. And you find out that all your coworkers got a 10% raise. Then you'd be really, really hurt and angry. On the other hand, it is really true. The main determinant of life satisfaction, just ask people how satisfied are you with their lives, is really their absolute level of income, not their relative level. Now, of course, this is on a logarithmic scale, which is to say, an extra $1,000 increases the happiness of a poor person a lot more than the happiness of a rich person.
Right.
But still, it occurs throughout the scale. If it was all strictly relative, you would expect that the richest person in a poor country would be happier than a person in the middle or even below the middle in a rich country. And that turns out not to be true. People in richer countries are happier. Richer people within every country are happier on average. Mm. And so absolute well-being really matters. I mean, and when you think about it, if your kids are healthy as opposed to one of them dying, if you can afford, if you're not hungry, if you can afford medical care, then the fact that someone next door has slightly better medical care, well, okay, that's you might wish you were in their shoes, but still you're much happier than if one of your children was mortally ill. However, but really, this is not to disagree with the point you made, because there's a difference between sheer inequality in the sense of knowing that people are better off than you, and a sense of unfairness. If you think that the reason that they're better off than you is that you've been screwed by an unfair system, that's what leads to discontent, and that's different from just a difference in wealth.
So I think that part of that that discontent and the motivation that we feel, this sort of impetus towards perhaps dramatic social action, even in politics, as a consequence of our perceiving injustice as being the reason for disparities, and when injustice in its own right being a terrible problem. You look at criminal justice and so on and so forth. I think that sense that wrongs need to be righted lends an imperative to activism and to the way in which we pursue conversations that sometimes can sort of spill into a way of communicating our differences that seeks to, in a sense, sort of cast aside, to sort of turn over the tables, if you will, and to abandon some of the norms of discourse and interaction that we might otherwise think to be sort of a staple part of a flourishing society, or at least a progressing society, in part because those things seem not to matter as much. When lives are on the line, when people's humanity is being threatened, or so it seems, when policies will either live or die in Congress on the basis of which way a conversation goes, my obligation to treat you with respect in the conversation may indeed feel quite a bit secondary to the need to just get the win, so to speak, in politics. And yet I would argue that the need to sort of engage in our dialogue in a certain way, and this isn't to say that we necessarily need to minimize emotion or authenticity or moral fervor or conviction in the way that we make our points and the way we advocate for our positions, but there's got to be some essential framework within which the way we communicate constrains us to some sort of commitment to mutual human dignity in the conversation that allows us to trust one another to begin with, I think, in order to facilitate conversations and modes of political engagement that allow potentially for consensus, and at least allow for one side to be willing to sort of go with the outcome of a particular political contest if it doesn't go their way. And so, in the context of Braver Angels work, so Braver Angels, as you may very well know, is America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization committed to political depolarization, but really within that, strengthening the fabric of our relationships with one another as citizens in America across partisan divides, racial divisions, and so forth. We're trying to sort of reintroduce a kind of a norm of goodwill, if you will, to the project of democracy, something that I think people have taken for granted so much for so long that it doesn't even seem like an imperative, but it is. And or at least I would assert it is. And so what I'd like to ask you, you're a person who I think rather famously has friendships with folks and, with peers and contemporaries ranging from Noam Chomsky way out on the left to Thomas Sowell way out on the right, which is pretty fascinating in and of itself. And I'd like to return to those gentlemen in particular, perhaps. But my question for you is, when you look at the project of civil society, of liberal democracy, of building sort of a civilization oriented towards human flourishing and human progress, to what degree are the gains that you identified in human society just a moment ago themselves dependent not merely on our material and technological sort of ability to foster these sorts of advancements, but on our social and cultural ability to maintain some functioning formula for how we engage and relate with each other interpersonally and ethically and so forth? What is the relationship between those two pieces in your view?
Yeah, they're both critical, because if we are ignorant of what can solve problems, of what can grow food, what can cure disease, what can instill literacy, then all the goodwill in the world aren't going to bring it about by magic. On the other hand, if you've got a solution in a book on a table and no one is willing to actually implement it, it may as well not exist. So they complement each other. The subtitle of my most recent book, Enlightenment Now, was The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. So progress was the phenomenon that I tried to show is real. And the explanation was a combination of reason and science, which would be kind of the know-how. How do you achieve an aim? But what I call humanism is the overall goal of making people better off, making people happier and healthier and better educated and more secure. Without that goal, then all the science and technology in the world could be deployed to more and more efficient weapons, or bioweapons as opposed to vaccines. So you've got to couple the know-how, the understanding of the world with the moral goal that which I argue, unlike a lot of moral systems where you're never going to get people to agree, especially religious ones. Is Jesus Christ our Savior? Is Muhammad the God's prophet? Right. You're not going to persuade each other at that. However, is it better for kids not to die? I mean, everyone agrees on that. Is it better for kids to be able to read and write? Is it better for people to be not in a state of poverty, well-fed? If there are diseases, is it better that we cure them? There at least, I'm not going to say that everyone agrees, but an awful lot of people do. And if we remember that those are our shared goals, very few people disagree that it's good, that life is better than death and peace is better than war, then that gives us a goal to aim for, and we can use our knowledge, our know-how, our science to achieve those goals.
So there's this relationship that exists between these two things, and yet, as I said a moment ago, it seems to me that we are rapidly sort of forgetting that relationship, and that I think has to constitute a serious threat to the prospects of any society that seeks flourishing and mutual freedom. This is not the book that I imagine you would have expected me to reference in this conversation, but this is the Steven Pinker book I know best, which is how the mind works. And it's a funny thing because I bought this book, I think probably 16 years ago or so, before I was in this line of work. I was going beyond my depths a little bit, Professor, because I wanted to know how the mind works, and I don't really have a background in that particular subject, but took plenty from it. What things that struck me back then was your treatment of. Well, you talked about the controversies related to the standard social science model, if I'm getting the abbreviation right. And at the time, it struck me to think that you could have folks in the hard sciences having arguments about subject matter that you might think would sort of invite sober reflection and mutual intellectual humility, and to have it instead turn into literal food fights. So I don't know that I'm going to read this whole passage here, and I don't know how long it's been since you've even thought about, some of the things that you wrote in this book. But I'm just going to read a little bit here and maybe jump around in a passage that, and I literally discovered, by the way, my old notes from this book. Hadn't looked at it for a decade or so. So this was a nice excuse to break this open again. But you wrote um, the, pardon me, the standard social science model not only has become an intellectual orthodoxy, but has acquired a moral authority. When social biologists first began to challenge it, they were met with a ferocity that is unusual even by the standards of academic invective. The biologist E.O. Wilson was doused with a pitcher of ice water at a scientific convention, and students yelled for his dismissal over bullhorns and put up posters urging people to bring noisemakers to his lectures. Angry manifestos and book linked denunciations were published by organizations with names like Science for the People and the Campaign Against Racism, IQ, and the Class Society. In Not in Our Genes, Richard Lewontin, pardon me if I mispronounce his name, Stephen Rose and Leon Kamen dropped innuendos about Donald Simon's sex life and doctored a defensible package of Richard Dawkins into an insane one. You go on at some length. But what's interesting about all of that is that I think that those incidents you were recounting in this book happened in the 80s. Am I right about that?
You are right. And some of them in the 70s. Yes, that's right.
Right. And
So,
so
yes, it was an early version of cancel culture. Absolutely.
yeah, and this book, you published this book, I think, in 1997.
That's correct. Yes.
And so, and I read, I read it, or I read that in the, this, what did I say? This would have been the early knots, the relatively early 2000s, probably 2008, 2009, something like that, actually. And even then, it seemed like something that wasn't unimaginable for me to read. Politics had already become quite insane in so many ways, and yet, what you wrote there would just be a drop in the bucket against the backdrop of the culture wars and what some people refer to as cancel culture, so on and so forth. Free speech controversies resulting in deplatformings of major, public figures at universities and mainstream publications, et cetera, that so many of us are so worried about today. So I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of an analysis in terms of how this trend or maybe sort of degrading of discourse has manifested itself in the university context and in the academic and maybe the scientific context in particular. And what do you see, if anything, as being sort of the hard relationship that exists between that story in the institutions of higher learning and it's kind of becoming more of a mainstream phenomenon of American social and political life, broadly speaking?
Yeah, so many good questions. So yes, indeed. Back in 1997, in How the Mind Works, I talked about what we would now call cancel culture and shaming mobs. There were no social media then. And I like to say, for those who blame the millennial generation or the Generation Z for the current wave of repression of free speech, I say Billy Joel was wrong. We did start the fire. We baby boomers. There it is.
So this is a boomer problem. Okay, boomer.
This is a boomer problem. It originated as a boomer problem, and it's not a coincidence because what often happens is some noisy students have a protest or write a letter, and it's baby boomers who are in charge of the universities, who are the presidents and the deans, and they're the ones who kind of cave at the first demand that someone be shut up or canceled. So I don't blame younger generations. I think that's a occupational hazard of growing older, and I try to avoid that. Now, and I wrote a follow-up book actually on you're right that I refer to it as the standard social science model, And I wrote a book called The Blank Slate, which is a little bit more precise in identifying the dogma that are people trying to preserve, namely that the human mind is a blank slate at birth, that there's no such thing as human nature, that everything, all of our desires, our emotions are written by parents and culture and media and education.
You're right. We should be clear in terms of what the sort of genesis for these controversies that you were referring to in that earlier book were. So I guess the blank slate proposition is essentially that we are a blank slate at birth, and that culture is the main driver of our, or maybe the sole driver of our behavior and so forth, individually and as groups. Whereas other folks, and I guess the field of biology more traditionally, and still with many folks, perhaps including yourself, would otherwise assert that biology and genes have a major role, perhaps not exclusive, but a major role in driving behavior and so forth. So that's sort of the crux of the controversy. Is that correct?
Indeed. And conceptions of human nature, including whether we are blank slates or whether human nature exists, have often driven a lot of political debates for centuries. And it's interesting that you brought up two of my influences, Thomas Sowell and Noam Chomsky, both of whom have written on this issue. Thomas Sowell wrote a brilliant book called A Conflict of Visions, where he asked the question, why are so many positions kind of bundled together on the right and other positions bundled together on the left? And you might think they have nothing to do with each other. So if you ask someone, what is your opinion on abortion? You can kind of predict pretty well their position on military spending, and on the police, and on constitutional originalism versus a living constitution. Why would all these, and income redistribution, why would all these things get packaged together? And right. Sowell argued that if you were to look at the nugget, the kernel at the core of the left-wing positions and of the right-wing positions, they would be different conceptions of human nature, whether human nature is infinitely malleable, we're blank slates, and so we can dream of whatever utopian society we want and try to engineer it, or whether humans are fatally or are flawed in wisdom and virtue and knowledge, and so need social institutions to prevent us from killing each other, from compensating for all of the dark sides of human nature. Now, that's the traditional dichotomy. And so there has been a kind of an association between human nature and right-wing positions and blank slate and left-wing positions.
Right.
But Chomsky is an example of someone who has shattered that dichotomy, because he very strongly believes in human nature. That was how, really, way back when I was a student, where I was awakened to the possibility of a rich human nature. But of course, as you mentioned, Chomsky is famously on the left. So he's a left-wing advocate of human nature, and he's not the only one. Peter Singer wrote a book called A Darwinian Left. Again, it's often people think of a kind of Darwinian approach to human behavior as something that right-wingers are happy with, but Singer tried to shatter that. And in The Blank Slate, and this is a theme that has animated a lot of my writings, I do believe that there's such a thing as human nature. I don't think we are blank slates. At the same time, I, above all, am an advocate of human progress that is actually taken place. We don't even have to debate whether human nature allows human progress to take place. Let's do it the other way around. Let's ask whether progress has taken place. The data say yes, and say, well, what is it about human nature that has made that possible?
Indeed.
Especially with violence. I had a book, I appreciate our parallel. My book was called The Better Angels of Our Nature. I love the name Braver Angels, by the way.
Yeah, thank you.
But that book documented many declines of violence over history, war and homicide, and violence against children, violence against women, and then tried to ask the question, first of all, why were our ancestors so violent? Why was there so much bloody torture and rape and war and genocide, and slavery, and lynchings? And then how have we managed to kind of bring these down? I mean, they still occur, so we can't be complacent. But efforts to reduce violence have not totally succeeded, but they've made a huge difference. What is it about human nature that allows that to happen? And so I talk about both our inborn traits that can lead to violence, like revenge, like the urge for dominance, like group psychology leading to racism and ethnocentrism and nationalism and xenophobia. But then on the other side, there are our better angels. We have empathy. We have self-control. We don't have to act on every impulse. We have reason, cognitive processes that allow us to develop workarounds to our dark side. Well, yeah, people will, if you live into their own devices, they will get into feuds and vendettas and blood revenge. But on the other hand, if you have a justice system, then that can substitute for the code of vendetta, and it would bring cycles of violence down. That's just an example of how you can use our heads to identify problems and then to try out solutions.
Indeed, and I think that there's immense value in locating within human nature our built-in capacity for altruism, for humanism, right? And really the fact that we do have a desire for that way of being, even as it's undeniable that obviously there are, we have the id, we have the flesh, the appetites, that carnal part of ourselves that causes us to act in ways we don't want to be, but we can mitigate against that, right? And so there's a conversation even about human nature that can go too far in one direction or the other, even if you accept the idea that there is such a thing. I mean, certainly you have people who will say that human beings are corrupt, human beings are are cynical, and it's in and of itself a cynical point of view, because we may be that, but we're more than that, and we can be better than that. By the way, on the subject of the name Better Angels, you may recall, of course, but Braver Angels was originally Better Angels. And when the Better Angels of Our Nature, the book came out, of course, we're both drawing on the same quote. We were in a little bit of a tug of war in the Google search results and so forth, trying to get to the top of the SEO rankings and so forth. So we ultimately became Braver Angels. The smaller part of the reason was because we were tired of wrestling Steven Pinker for the top slot on the Google results. The bigger thing, there are a couple of other things, but the big thing, one of the big things at least, was that we seized upon this sort of reality that seemed to say that, it takes a lot of courage to be able to sort of stand in the better angels of one's nature. You get vilified for that sometimes, not just by the people who disagree with you or who distrust you because maybe you've got a different party registration than they do, and the label identifies you as an enemy, but you also receive social punishment from friends and people who are otherwise ideological or political compatriots, because we oftentimes think of the idea of empathizing with one's opponents as being a type of selling out, a type of betrayal, right? And so courage as a virtue in the context of extending social empathy and social grace seemed like something we wanted to emphasize, hence the idea of bravery, of braver angels, right?
Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, indeed. But I would like to ask you personally a little bit about sort of your own human nature and what sort of in your personality, and maybe this is just a product of experience, study, but sort of what allows you to to be able to, I think, sort of freely and widely range out in your discussions with folks whose politics differ dramatically from yours in ways that allow you to, I think, not just learn from individuals across the spectrum, but I think it seems to me like you genuinely enjoy engaging in these dialogues in ways that maybe are internally fulfilling. I mean, I will note that Noam Chomsky is somebody who I frequently just see sort of vociferously, opposed and dismissed and disregarded by people on the right as just being sort of a ludical a sort of a radical commie or what have you. And Thomas Sowell is somebody who just you look at social media, people just step on him and his credentials on the left because folks don't want to engage either of their opinions, and yet both of them dramatically and substantially influential thinkers in our country, in our recent history, and both of them friends of yours who I take it you've learned a fair amount from. So what psychologically sort of allows you to walk that line and derive value from these friendships and conversations?
Yes, well, I may not be the best person to judge, but what I try to cultivate is deep understanding and insight, always asking the question why, Why does it have to be that way? Why couldn't it have been some other way? And this is something that I admire both in Sowell and in Chomsky.
Mm.
A dissatisfaction with surface phenomena, a desire to get beneath the surface and find out what ultimately drives ideas, what drives humans, what is the core idea. And so we can sort of diagnose also where our disagreements lie. What ultimately do we disagree on? But also, as a social scientist, I like to think that I export the ethic of trying to put our ideas to a test.
Mm.
You know, and you mentioned this earlier, none of us is infallible. None of us is omniscient. We're not born knowing. We are, none of us has a pipeline to the truth. None of us is an angel, to get back to our joint favorite metaphor. We're humans. We've got, human brains. We've got, the world is complicated. It's very hard to understand. We're going to be wrong, most of us, about most things, most of the time. What is our hope in understanding the world? And that is if I were to pinpoint what is the scientific ethos or value system, it is you try to understand things by formulating hypotheses, possible explanations, and then trying to let the world tell you whether they're right or wrong. And ideally, now this goes against human nature. It's a force within each of us that we have to repress. We all want to be right, but we can't all be right, not all the time. Among other things, we disagree with each other, and we're all human. But to the extent that we can let the world tell us which of our ideas are right or wrong, then we can make progress. We can make progress not just in things we want, like curing disease, developing sources of clean energy, but also perhaps in reducing the kind of partisanship and sectarianism and polarization where people see each other as enemies rather than people who disagree. Because if we agree, if we can somehow get to a set of values, sometimes called active open-mindedness or epistemic humility. And again, you referred to these earlier in the conversation. You didn't use that jargon, but right. you called out those ideas. The idea that we've got to be prepared to change our minds. We have to be aware of our own limitations, that we aren't infallible, and it's only by tossing ideas out there and examining them to see which is right and which is wrong that we have any hope of understanding our world.
Well, and you're right, of course, that human nature resists, the idea that we could be wrong. I frequently say to folks that, on the one hand, I think I'm right about everything I think individually, because otherwise I wouldn't think it, every individual thought. On the other hand, I know that I'm wrong about something, and maybe even most things, because I know, just how fallible a creature I actually am, right? So
it's so true. Philosophy, actually, there's a term for it in philosophy.
Yeah.
It's sometimes called the paradox of the preface. As you open a book, and the preface, the author always confesses, and he says, I take responsibility for all the errors in this book. You might say, well, why don't you fix the errors? And of course, the problem is you don't know what they are, or you would have fixed them. But at a kind of meta level, looking down on yourself, well, no one's perfect. I know the errors are there. I don't at this moment know what they are, but I'm not so deluded to think that I haven't made any. Exactly.
Well, and isn't that funny? You're actually provoking a thought in me for the first time, or the first time I've had this thought in this way, at least, which is that I think that when we engage in conversation and communication, there may be a sense in which we are always maybe sort of communicating in two different ways. And one way, of course, is just sort of the straightforward of what, in terms of what it is we're saying, substantively speaking, right? But then at the same time, we're always also subtly and implicitly communicating in a how fashion, sort of, either the substance of humility and curiosity or the substance of certainty and arrogance, right? And other things, to the side and in between. And so, I guess that's where the value of inflection and tonality and body language, and by the way, perhaps not coincidentally, so many of the things that are missing from social media and so forth. Speaking of train wrecks of communication, but so much of, I guess, the substance of the preface, if you will, goes into aspects of our demeanor in communication that are not necessarily, explicitly named in everything we say in a conversation, but that are nevertheless perhaps vital for providing these sort of, the if you take this metaphorically, sort of the spiritual context of the dialogue and the exchange as we have it, in a way that either gives us permission to think of each other as friends or demand that we be on our guard as potential enemies. Does that make some sense?
Oh man, that really ties into one of my own kind of professional research obsessions. I study language, and the two layers of communication that you identified drive so much of ordinary human conversation. So let me and I have written about this and studied it in a kind of an everyday setting, not so much in this airing of political disagreements, but it applies there as well. I'll just give you an example. Ordinary politeness. So we're sitting at a table, and I say, if you could pass the salt, that would be awesome. Now, when you think about it, that's a really bizarre thing to say. I mean, it wouldn't be awesome. And why don't you just say, give me the salt? And the reason is that, as you point out, language is always doing two things. We are conveying information, in this case, the request to pass the salt, but we're also negotiating our social relationships. Are we equals? Are we intimates? Do I dominate you, or do I owe respect for you? And the reason we don't just say, give me the salt, is that you're kind of treating the person like they're your servant. You don't want to do that, but you really do want the salt.
Right.
And so we use these all these tricks of politeness and euphemism and innuendo and doublespeak and shilly-shallying, so that the person kind of catches our drift. They read between the lines. They know what we want, but we haven't breached some kind of social relationship. And we see that in polite requests. You see it in the whole language of seduction and bribery and threats. Like you want to come up for Netflix and chill. That's a whole lot more comfortable than do you want to have sex? Gee, officer, is there some way we could settle the ticket without going through all that paperwork? Instead of, if I give you $50, will you let me go? Or the kind of dialogue we're familiar with from The Sopranos. Nice story you got there. Would be a real shame if something happened to it. All of that, all those cases where we use these weasel words precisely because we're doing two things at the same time with language. So how does that relate to disagreement, and which of course is the topic of your interest, my interest here? Well, it is true that there's that cliche to disagree without being disagreeable. We have to disagree because no one has the truth. The more of us that disagree, the greater the probability that at least one of us is right. On the other hand, it is kind of hurtful and painful to be told you're wrong, and of course, a lot of times we are wrong. We got to get used to it. The question is, how do we have this evaluation of ideas? And ideas come from people, and people have human nature, where the best ideas win, but the people who advance them aren't humiliated, punished, silenced, canceled, denigrated, and so on. That is the challenge of civil discourse.
Well, and in a strictly utilitarian sense, I think that there's a real way in which you even need ideas that are ultimately erroneous to sort of surface, just to provide the opportunity for for ideas that may ultimately be more correct to evolve and come to fruition and be articulated, right? So even in that sense, like, we practically sort of need the wheat and the chaff to kind of be joined for a moment in order for them to be appropriately kind of separated, if that makes some sense.
Oh, absolutely makes sense. I mean, sometimes you say, well, let me play devil's advocate. That can be a very useful way of clarifying ideas, or what's the opposite of what you're proposing. Because sometimes people are talking in such vague generalities that it can mean anything. And until you know what it's not saying, you don't know what it is saying. So yes, we got to always have these ideas. Plus, the thing is that until you actually express an idea and evaluate it, who knows whether it's right or wrong.
Mm.
There are all kinds of ideas that might be right that no one has even broached. And broaching ideas means that a lot of them will end up being wrong.
Mm, indeed. Geez, you gave me another thought a moment ago, which potentially delivers us into an area of significant complexity. So it's dangerous to raise it at this point. But when we talk about these sort of two layers, maybe the explicit and the implicit kind of level of communication, you talk about pass the salt and so forth. It'd be awesome if you pass the salt, and these kind of peculiar sort of linguistic and other sort of ways in which we try to sort of set the emotional tone of a conversation. It occurs to me that so much of our current polarization, whether it's on campus or out in politics generally in society generally speaking, I attribute a fair amount of it to the fact that America has always been a very diverse nation, but more and more diverse all the time. Certainly in an ethnic context, both through, and not only is it more diverse in terms of increasing number of immigrants and so forth coming into the fray, but I think America has also become much more diverse within her institutions because you have social mobility with African Americans and other people of color and from other communities and so on and so forth. And part of what I think happens, sort of, boiling something that's got a whole lot of other factors at play down to sort of just a simplistic way of explaining this, is that I think that within cultures, you have different ways of sort of setting that emotional and sort of environment within a certain community of context that maybe are not very easily sort of transported out of a sort of a native cultural context into another one or into a particular institutional context. So, for example, I come from a multicultural family, and I'm a what you might call biracial individual. I mean, I'm African American and Anglo American to put it simply, And there is I'll say that there's definitely a difference in sort of members of my family on each side in terms of the ease of like physical contact and so forth. On the black side of my family, folks go in for the hug much more quickly. White side of my family, affectionate family too, but my grandparents in particular would not have been quite as quick to wrap their arms around somebody they didn't know or had just heard nice things about, right? Here's another example that really kind of crystallizes it. The use of the B word, in casual context to sort of signify like endearment, like B word please or whatnot. You use that word in one context, and people actually can use it as like a signifier of social comfort. In another context, that's just a glaring insult,
I
and
feel very innocent and naive here. Do you mean the
well,
gendered B word?
well, yeah. So I mean, the
Yeah, no, I just want to be sure that I know which B word
right.
we're
So
referring.
in sort of like a hip hop pop culture
Oh, yeah,
context
right.
and so
Yes,
forth,
right.
you
Sure.
can use that word in
Yeah,
ways that just casual and actually suggest friendship, right?
yeah.
So it's just to say that I mean another example. I remember reading a book that had to do with an interracial relationship between a young white man and I think a Cambodian woman, and she had a younger brother, and in an effort to sort of endear himself to the younger brother, he reaches his hand out and tussles his hair, not realizing that that's actually an insult, or at least maybe not an insult, but just a massive breach of of etiquette in the culture that she was from. And so I wonder if there's not some way in which, given the sort of rapid pace through these different levels of social integration, maybe also social media's tendency to throw us all into a big tumultuous pot and stew us together, I wonder if there's a way in which it doesn't just simply seem easier to suggest that proper social standing with respect to one party to another is conveyed more through having the right set of politics, right, as kind of a simplifier for the thing that should unite us in understanding whose intentions are good and whose intentions are not, rather than going through the more complex work of genuinely empathizing past the differences in our cultural decorum to sort of ascertain where folks are coming from fundamentally in contentious, sort of social intergroup, conflicts and conversations. So I'm kind of articulating an idea as it's coming to me, but does that sort of hang together a little bit in your view?
Oh, yeah, a lot of the things that you brought up that I think we're both aware of. So, one is it's true that certain political comments, ideas can be kind of touchstones of group identity.
Mm.
And I'm aware of that as a teacher because, in my family, a circle of friends, I could toss off a Trump insult, and I know that everyone would, we bond over that.
Right.
When I'm in my class, I don't know the politics of hundreds of students in front of me, and it's be irresponsible for me as a teacher to assume that every last student, was a Democrat. Maybe
Right.
there's some Trump supporters, and I'm teaching them too. And so I'm at least careful of not just, if I have a criticism, I'll defend the criticism, but just the kind of wisecrack, joke, insult that ordinarily just bonds people of similar politics. I'm careful not to toss those off. And you're right, there are all kinds of markers that as we become more diverse, we have to become aware of that innocent remarks, jokes, gestures, body contact can have different meanings in different cultures. And of course, we're richer to be aware of them, to keep the ones that, and let them spread if they are, if they're desirable, if they bring people together. If one culture has a nice toast, like l'chaim, the Jewish toast to life, great if everyone appropriates it. If men hugging each other, and it's a great example that you gave, because I remember long time, maybe 15, 20 years ago, my first friend of mine who was Afro-Caribbean would greet me with a hug. And at that time, I think it's become more common. Maybe it'll go in the other direction now with COVID. But at the time, men hugging each other was kind of rare. But we did it, and it was really, really nice. And it's just a nice custom for all of us to adopt, at least when all of us are vaccinated. But yes, so this, and that's what's so great about living in a diverse, multicultural society. It just makes life so much richer, so much more interesting, potentially, and it can reduce misunderstandings if we have the kind of meta awareness. Yeah, not everyone grew up like I did. Let me, try to understand their customs. Maybe I'll even adopt some.
Right, indeed. Well, and so that suggests something that I believe, at least very firmly, which is that cultural diversity and as well as intellectual diversity. I think that there is a degree to which diversity can be difficult to manage, and finding a sort of a mode of integration that, on the one hand, allows us all to sort of remain authentically who we are with our own particular sorts of traditions and practices and habits, but at the same time to sort of unite in some loyalty to ideals and principles, and maybe sort of a superseding kind of sense of shared identity in the context of a nation or an institution. It seems to me like there's sort of perhaps there's greater complexity in trying to foster that sort of balanced integration across greater stretches of diversity, but maybe also greater reward at the end of the day. And I certainly feel like so much of the sort of the joy of American society at its best comes from the fact that ultimately, we are kind of a product of one another. We influence one another, and as far apart as some of our starting points in life experience and other domains are, it feels all the richer when we're able to cross those bridges and find each other in some sense of shared humanity.
Yeah, and there's a real challenge. I don't think we really understand when bringing diverse people together leads them to look for some common, universal, superordinate goal, and when it just leads to animosity and sectarianism. In general, I like to think that overall, bringing diverse people together, especially if they have a common goal, means that what's left at the end of the day, after all of our differences and disagreements, is we're all humans. We all have to eat. We all have to stave off disease. We all have to teach our kids to read. None of us likes being assaulted or killed. That's something that no matter what our differences are, we have that in common. And there are episodes in history where when people are thrown together with a common goal, they do resolve their differences and good things can result. I think one example I write about in Enlightenment Now is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed in the late 1940s, where the world was still reeling from the massively destructive war and genocides of World War II. They kind of said, well, gee, let's not do that again. what do we do to prevent that from happening? Now, you bring countries together, China and Soviet Union and the United States and Malaysia and Catholic countries and Muslim countries and African countries, Ethiopia. So what do they have in common? Let's say that you put them in a room and you say, okay, write down something that you all agree on. Well, clearly, if the United States said the first article will be United States is a sacred city on a hill and a beacon to the world. Well, you're probably not going to get a lot of other countries to agree with that.
Probably.
Or the foundation of world progress is we all accept Jesus Christ as our savior. Well, okay, India is not going to go along with that, and probably not China, and then not Malaysia. Okay, so not that. Well, you might say, okay, well, then there's nothing left. But that turns out not to be true. There's plenty left because we're all human. And when you get people together to enhance their common humanity, you have to put aside all of these differences. And there's plenty left. There's plenty to work for. Life is tough enough just being human, let alone whatever religion or race or ethnic group you belong to.
Indeed. Well, this has been a fun conversation, Professor Pinker. By the way, I forgot to introduce you the way I wanted to introduce you. Up top, I always told myself that if I ever had the chance to talk to you, I would introduce you as the man with the best hair in science. And lo and behold, I had my chance and I messed it up at the front end, so I'll get it in on the back. Hey, let's leave it off on a hopeful note, and like I said, I think this has been a fun, edifying conversation. I hope we can have you back for more. What gives you hope? What is it that you not only would like to see in this moment of time where we are the beneficiaries of so much human progress, and yet, polarization, perhaps an inability to be fully grateful for just all of the things that we have to be thankful for at this moment, maybe threatens a bit of a stagnation in terms of our ability to build upon that progress. What do you hope to see and think could be possible in terms of our being able to orient ourselves in the right way towards one another, and the continuing development and progress of human civilization here and abroad?
What gives me hope is really the comparison with the past. It's sometimes said that the best explanation for the good old days is a bad memory, and we have terrible problems today. There's just no question they're awful problems. But yesterday's problems were worse, and people deployed their ingenuity together with the goal of making people better off, and they eked out increments of improvement. It can be done. It has been done. The work is not complete, but the fact that we have brought about progress means that it's possible to achieve still more.
Indeed. Professor Pinker, thank you so much, and tell people where they can find the book, Rationality.
It will be released in September, but it is available for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and in your local bookstore for pre-order as well.
Absolutely. Well, we hope to have you back. It's been an honor and a pleasure to talk to you, Stephen. And for folks who are interested in, supportive of the mission of Braver Angels, we ask you to get involved. Join us as a member. Sign up at braverangels.org. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We are building a house united. Until next time, thank you all very much.